I'm Philippa Strum. I'm a senior scholar at the center, and it's my pleasant duty today to introduce our speaker and then moderate the discussion that we hope will follow. And our speaker is Nora Fisher-Onar, who is, as she says, a person with two hats. She's both at the Department of Politics and International Relations at Başakşehir University in Istanbul, and at the Center for International Studies in the Department of Politics and International Relations at Oxford University. She is the author of numerous book chapters and journal articles. I'm not going to repeat her whole vita, but for the benefit of the people who are watching this on the webcast, I'll say just a couple of words about her. The people in the room have a biography in front of them. The titles of her articles and chapters include things like Convergence and Resistance, The European Dilemma of Turkish Intellectuals, How Deep a Transformation, Europeanization of Greek and Turkish Minority Policies, and Echoes of a Universalism Lost, Rival Representations of the Ottomans in Today's Turkey. Professor Fisher-Onar speaks 5 languages, has lived in a multiplicity of countries, and will be talking to us today about an issue that certainly has been of importance to policymakers here in Washington, the whole question of what the AKP party is up to, what its real beliefs are, why it is seemingly, or perhaps actually, you'll have to tell us, inconsistent in some of the policies that it follows, whether it's really interested in joining the European Union or whether it's not really interested in joining the European Union, what its attitude towards women may be. I mean, all kinds of things of this kind that have policymakers a little bit concerned about what particularly this may mean for relationships between the United States and Turkey. So that is going to be the subject of Professor Fisher-Onar's talk to you.
Right. Well, thank you very much for having me here. It's wonderful to be in DC at this beautiful weather. I seem to be very fortunate. I would like to actually jump in and launch my remarks in a somewhat unorthodox fashion by citing the poem by Robert Frost, which I think everyone is familiar with, which inspired the title of my presentation, and which is, of course, entitled Roads Not Taken. And I'm sure you all remember the poem from English 101 or high school course at some point. I'm not sure where it appears in the curriculum these days. But the thrust of the poem is that one can arrive at a fork in the roads and has to make a stark decision, a momentary decision, even a passing decision about which pathway, which trajectory to pursue. And in the poem, the lone rider ends up going by the path less taken, and this is later on proves to be a source of great meaning for him. But he always wonders, somewhat nostalgically, about what the other path would have delivered. And I think this is a promising starting point for launching our conversation today, because it seems that Turkey is indeed at a fork in the roads. And of course, we've heard this trope for decades now: Turkey at the crossroads, Turkey between the West and Islam, Turkey, and all such representations. But I think the situation is probably more intense and somewhat more serious today than it has been in the past. In that sense, the poem is powerful because it tells us about the importance of small, incremental, almost haphazard decisions in thrusting actors into one pathway or trajectory or another. And I think in the past 10 years, we've seen a series of small episodes, some, of course, more dramatic than others, but a series of events that have ended up kind of nudging or prodding Turkey in a direction that is unprecedented vis-a-vis its relations, vis-a-vis its own internal constitution and its foreign policy towards its regions and its relations with the West more broadly. And in this sense, the poem may be promising, but I do think it does reflect a tendency which also characterizes the logic of policymakers at times and of journalists all too often, of framing choices in a binary fashion and of thinking of choices as being a stark choice between one path or another. And if there's anything that the Turkish government is trying to project, and I'm not sure how much this is being picked up upon in Washington or in Brussels, if there's a message that they're trying to project, it is that it doesn't have to be an either-or equation, and that if the juncture that we are at today is one in which Turkey was no longer making a choice between the West and the rest, as it made during the Cold War, but instead trying to opt for a pathway of the West plus the rest, then and I think in this for Turkey is quite non-negotiable. The message that I think the government is really trying to project is that this does include very much the West. And one of the themes and the sort of main points I'm going to make throughout this presentation is whether Turkey is able to kind of have its cake and eat it too, and pursue both pathways, is going to have a lot to do with the sort of dialectical interactions with its interlocutors in the West. And in order to illustrate that, I think it's probably best to take as our starting point the empirical transformation that we have witnessed in Turkey in the past 10 years. I first moved to Turkey as a Fulbright scholar after finishing up here at Georgetown in 1998, and the country is almost unrecognizable from the country I first set foot in 10 years ago. It is a country where the old political establishment that had controlled both domestic trajectories and foreign policy since the inception of the Republic in 1923 has been completely displaced at this point for all effective purposes. And the new pro-religious establishment, which is led by the Justice and Development Party, that I'm going to refer to by its Turkish acronym, the AKP, has usurped the presidency, the government, the parliament. It has achieved the unthinkable in that it has dislodged the military custodians of the Republican project from their reserve domain, to the extent that Binaz Toprak, a well-known scholar in Turkey and my boss and a friend of Philip Esram's, has observed that no officer in the Turkish military today would even dream, while they're sleeping, would even dream of trying to enact a coup or a sort of military intervention. So this is really a dramatic change in the state of affairs in light of the many different military interventions that Turkey has undergone in the past. Moreover, there is we are now in the post-referendum period. There was an important referendum, as you probably know, on the 12th of September, and the party has come out empowered from that referendum and is likely to now restructure or overhaul the judiciary in a fashion that will also mean the sort of last check on its agenda that was set in place by the old secularist establishment will likely in the upcoming months and years also dissipate. This has been accompanied, of course, by the EU accession process, which was quite vibrant in the early 2000s and was spearheaded by the AKP. And that opened up the way for a domestic transformation, which has entailed the problematization of the old official line on numerous and highly controversial questions like the Armenian issue and the Kurdish issue. It has also opened the way for a new foreign policy portfolio and profile, and that is in many respects what I'm here to discuss today, although I do think it's very important to envisage Turkish domestic and foreign policy as functioning as a sort of nexus. You can't really understand one without the other. They very much feed back into each other. And all of this, of course, has been accompanied by an economic boom that has really sustained the party through this transformation it has enacted, such that Turkey now, on the eve of the economic crisis, attracted some $20 billion in foreign direct investment, up from a scant billion in the 1990s. It is climbing its way up the ranks of the G20. I believe most recently it was G15, and it's anticipated by some observers that Turkey will have the 10th largest economy in the world by 2050. So the upshot of this is, in terms of the average person on the street, is certainly a sense of discombobulation, as it were, at the very rapidly transformed state of affairs, and also for many people a sense of empowerment, most overwhelmingly because of the economic transformation. Now, of course, not everyone is delighted by the change. Certainly, the old elite that has been displaced is perturbed, as are their interlocutors in the West. But there's also people who are not necessarily who may even favor aspects of the AKP's program, but who's are not natural constituents of the party in terms of its kind of ideological roots. And these people include non-religious women, for example, or nationalist and secularist Kurds, or heterodox Alevis, all of whom, for various reasons, have reason to feel, at least at best, a great deal of ambivalence towards a pro-religious Sunni party and its constituency, which it effectively has what one scholar has called an it's a condition of electoral hegemony. They're set to win the next elections. They will probably win the elections after that. So people like this, non-Muslims as well, gays and lesbians, for example, are somewhat concerned. Now, in order to make sense of this transformation, we often reach for frames or slogans or turns of phrase to capture such dramatic events. And for the past few years, a couple of people have been using the term neo-Ottomanism. And this is a term that is useful because it does speak to the one dimension of the AKP agenda, which is to rehabilitate the memory of the Ottoman past and use it as a source of inspiration for their domestic agenda and foreign policy platform. But it's a problematic term because I think it only highlights one aspect of the party platform on one hand, and it also, for the very simple reason that it is rejected by the party. They don't endorse it as a term, and the reason for this is because it certainly does have neo-imperialist connotations, and the concern is that this would alienate the very people who the party is actually trying to reach out to by invoking the Ottoman legacy. A second term, and this is the one we hear most recently, especially in the wake of the incident at Davos, the Gaza flotilla debacle. This is the notion that Turkey is, in Turkish shifting axes. I think in the Western press it tends to be as Turkey turning its back on the West. And this, again, speaks to a dynamic that is at play in the sense that, this is what I alluded to in reference to the Robert Frost poem, in the sense that Turkey is certainly no longer willing to subordinate its interests to Western interest. But again, I think that it's an insufficient way of framing framing the AKP agenda in the sense that this does not have the will to stand behind Turkey's own vision of what is good for itself and its neighborhood does not have to go across purposes with its commitments and alliance with the West. So in order to try and develop a more rigorous framework that may help us make a sense of what does appear to be quite inconsistent outbursts and kind of contradictory policies on the part of the establishment, I think it's analytically useful to disaggregate the repertoire into 4 strands, into 4 stories that the party tells. And these stories are projected towards different audiences, and they're deployed at different times by different actors. So, for example, for some members of the party, one story is more important than for others. But overall, if we disaggregate the party's domestic and foreign policies into these 4 categories that I have defined, labeled as a democratization discourse or narrative, a conservative, religious, or post-Islamist narrative, and I'm happy to define the term post-Islamist later if you like. There is an Ottomanist narrative, which speaks back, of course, to the label of neo-Ottomanism that some people are using. And then there's a power political narrative, but it's a power political that is very much informed by the logic of soft power, not hard power. I think that one can make sense of various episodes of the past few years by thinking of them as representing moments where the party has deployed one of these narratives, and when crises erupt, it's very often because wires have crossed between narratives and short-circuited. So, for example, as I will go on to show, the sort of the fallout of the Gaza flotilla incident involved a sort of a short-circuiting of the universal rights humanitarian discourses on one hand and post-Islamist narratives on the other. Now, my argument today is that, as I said, these discourses are deployed at different times for different audiences. They can short-circuit. I believe that the overwhelming drive behind the logic underpinning the party's platform is really the soft power political narrative. This is what underpins the other preferences, and I think that this is a hopeful. This presents us with a hopeful picture in the sense that the soft power logic can be used to help untangle and make sense and reconcile some of the contradictions that are embedded in the other three narratives. But of course, we need to understand what these narratives are in order to make any sort of assessment over which is more or less important. Again, as I've stated at the beginning, I do think that even if the party's preferences are towards emphasizing this soft power logic, which narrative ultimately becomes the most salient will have a lot to do not just with the party preference themselves, but with the way that interactions unfold between the AKP and Washington and Brussels in the upcoming months and years. So. First, it's useful to think about the historical sources of these narratives, and here we can also pinpoint some of the reasons for apparent inconsistencies in the party's repertoire, because the building blocks, as it were, of these narratives emanate from different periods and different experiences in the genesis of the party and its evolution over time. So one very important source is the memory of the Kemalist Cultural Revolution, which basically sought to disestablish Islam and Ottoman institutions, and this is remembered in pro-religious circles in terms of sort of existential bereavement. It's a point of rupture and of trauma in which Turkey and Turks were severed from their organic roots and over the course of the 20th century have been engaged in a project of trying to rehabilitate and rehabilitate that past and those connections. So this is one source of the party's logic. I think a second and very important tradition is the center-right political party tradition that was at first spearheaded in the 1950s, for those of you who are familiar with Turkish politics, by Adnan Menderes and his Democrat Party, and this is a tradition of political and economic liberalism in which there's also a laissez-faire attitude towards religiosity that is embedded within the framework of political liberalism. And this has been electorally the most successful tradition in Turkish political history, and has brought the country two very charismatic leaders who remain iconic figures for the AKP today. In fact, on my plane over here yesterday, I had a spread of newspapers from all of the different political camps, and it was striking to see that the two newspapers that are really directed towards pro-religious audiences, Yeni Şafak and Zaman, both had pictures of and allusions to Menderes and Turgut Özal in, for example, the crossword puzzle. In the middle of the crossword puzzle, there was a picture of Özal. So he's very much a reference. Then there's the third political Islamist source of the party's repertoire, and this goes back to the tradition launched by Necmettin Erbakan in the late 1960s, which was the dominant tradition in Turkish political Islam up until the late 1990s, when the leaders of the current AKP broke away. This is a tradition very much informed by anti-Westernism, anti-Zionism, from a a very sort of selective reading of the imperative to westernize as one in which one can take the technology and the science of the West, but must really preserve authentic Turkish Muslim cultural values and go back to the roots, the old Ottoman roots, and so forth. So these are sort of the three kind of historical sources of the party's repertoire, which is one reason why you see inconsistencies today, because there's a clash in the logics between the second and the third traditions, for example, with one emphasizing the primacy of the individual and the other emphasizing the primacy of the Muslim community. Now, moving on to contemporary discourses, as I've said, I've argued that you can disaggregate AKP logics into four stories, and one of them is the democratization story. And this is the story that was certainly the most salient in its first term in office from 2002 to 2007. This is the story that gave the momentum and inspiration to the EU accession process at the time when it still appeared to be a viable prospect. And this has its roots in that second historical tradition, the center-right tradition. It entails an acceptance of the individual, of a secularized individual as the basis for being in action. And that said, it also entails an attempt to sort of synthesize liberal values and liberal logics with piety to a certain extent. So, for example, in the headscarf debates, you see this syncretic logic at work. There's an attempt to describe the headscarf on one hand as a matter of the freedoms and the right to freedom of expression, right to freedom of religion, the right to access to education on the part of pious women, but this is somehow fused, sometimes problematically, at least from the perspective of courts who have heard the cases made by veiled women. This is sometimes fused with with the idea that veiling is also a matter of religious obligation in which there's no room for individual agency, and so this syncretic approach to liberal ideas can be very exciting and interesting, but it can sometimes come up against some walls. Another feature of the democratization repertoire is a tendency to speak in the name of the people and to very much associate and equate the party's preferences with those of the people. This gives rise to, this is how we can account for the sort of populist and rather majoritarian interpretation of democracy that is often displayed by the party. And this entails a negation, this is also a way of negating the concerns of other factions in society, because if the party is equated with the people and someone is criticizing the party, then they are implicitly criticizing and distinct from the people and are not authentic representatives of the people. So this is a sort of a discursive mechanism that is also used to delegitimize the concerns articulated by the AKP's political rivals. Now, this is a source of concern for many people. It's one of the main it's one of the main criticisms that is brought to bear against the AKP. And in order to compensate for this, the party engages in a very often quite poignant instances of inclusive gestures, some of which bear fruit, some of which don't. So, for example, after the 2007 national elections, which brought the party to power again, and in which they received many votes from people who were voting for democracy and democratization and not voting for the party's, and not really part of the party's core constituency, in Erdogan's acceptance speech after those elections, it was very inclusive, it was very pluralistic, it was very reassuring to the various groups I identified at the beginning of the lecture who may approve of civilization of state and society, but have some concerns about some lifestyle concerns under a pro-religious administration. And another sort of significant instance of this sort of outreach and this attempt to be more inclusive, despite the somewhat bombastic majoritarian logic that does inform the party's understanding of democracy, are, of course, the openings, the democratic openings of 2009, so the outreach to Kurds, to Alevis, to Armenians, to non-Muslims, to the liberal intelligentsia, even to cinematographers at one point. There was an opening towards them as well. And what that basically entailed was an announcement that the party was basically opening debate on these controversial sort of or sensitive subjects, and meeting with community leaders or intellectuals who were very much engaged in these questions, and then sitting back and watching as the Turkey's quite lively media and columnists and various spokespersons for various factions in society engaged in a debate over these issues. Not that much came out of it. There were some concrete proposals, such as the reinstitution of Kurdish names for Kurdish towns, or the reopening of the Greek Orthodox Seminary on Halki Helvili Island in Istanbul, or the abrogation of obligatory religion classes for Alevis. But we haven't seen a lot of sort of action on this front. This has led critics to charge the party with being opportunistic and simply trying to siphon off votes of that some 40% of the country who is ambivalent. But the response has been that even if there has been not a lot of concrete progress yet, this is a process, and that in any case, it has contributed to the desecuritization of these issue areas, which have long been very controversial. Last but not least, there is an invocation of the EU values, EU standards, and when relations with the EU are bumpy, of universal values and universal standards on the part of the party. This is primarily deployed as a sort of a discursive maneuver against the old establishment whenever there's an electoral campaign or there was the campaign over the referendum. This is primarily directed at domestic audiences, but it's also invoked in exchanges with the EU, sometimes as a critique of EU actors who are reluctant to accept Turkey on the grounds that the EU is not living up to its own standards by behaving in an exclusionary and culturalist fashion towards a Turkey that is merely trying to uphold these European/universal values. So that's the democratization narrative, which, as I said, was quite salient so long as the EU process was up and running. And now that that's been practically moribund for the past several years, other discourses have come to the forefront. And the one that I think is most sort of striking and the cause of the most concern in Washington is the conservative religious, or what I call post-Islamist discourse. And this has its roots in the Islamist tradition of Necmettin Erbakan, from which the party broke away. But it's post-Islamist in the sense that it eschews revolution. There's no agenda, at least in my view. There's no attempt to or no will to reenact the Iranian Revolution in Turkey. It's more about wanting to uphold conservative religious values in a society that is economically modernized and perhaps politically pluralistic, but an attempt to along the lines of perhaps Christian Democrat parties to really uphold family values and the various other sort of idiosyncratic forms that conservative values take in a Muslim context. Now, if the democratization discourse is syncretic and tries to fuse the logic of liberalism and piety, the conservative religious or post-Islamist approach is more selective. It reflects this platform that had been articulated by Erbakan and his parties over the second half of the 20th century, that it's okay to adopt the technologies of governance and production of the West, but that we must be true to authentic Turkish Muslim values. And one interesting feature of this discourse is that the unit of analysis is not the individual, as it is in the democratization frame, but it is tends to be civilization. actually. And in this sense, it can take a very binary type of form and reflect kind of an inverse Huntingtonian logic that envisages Turkey as the leader of a Muslim bloc that is diametrically opposed to a Western/Christian, post-Christian bloc. And this is not something that any of the leadership of the party articulates at all. But it is something that one can encounter in the discourses of columnists who write newspapers affiliated with the party. It's more perhaps a logic that is salient among some of the grassroots of the party. And this sort of civilizationist logic can take kind of very simplistic binary forms, as I just pointed out, but it can also display much more sophistication and nuance in what has been called an Occidentalist framework. And this is, rather than just a criticism of the West, this is more it's more of a sort of broader critique of Western modernity and various institutions and processes which it has given rise to, such as instrumental reason and the idea that the West is kind of consuming itself and is going to collapse in its own greed, and it's up to the Muslim world, with Turkey at its helm, to salvage what is admirable about Western modernity, but infuse it with a restorative Islam. And so this is, again, types of discourses that one sees in the writings of intellectuals and not so much in the party leadership. That said, Ahmet Davutoğlu, the foreign minister, is a well-known intellectual. He was a professor at a university in Istanbul in the 1990s, a professor of international relations, who employed quite multidisciplinary methods to really forward an intellectual agenda that has been very compelling to many of the people who've engaged it, which basically seeks to, I like to say, de-Euro-center, not the frames of reference of Turkish policymakers and Turkish intellectuals. So it's basically, in this sense, it's a very sophisticated Occidentalist critique that tries to encourage Turks to think out of the Westernist box, and I saw a map at a conference a few weeks ago that I thought was very telling in this respect. Instead of showing Turkey as sort of a crossroads between East and West, it was a map that had Turkey at the center of the world, with concentric circles around Turkey. So a different perspective, and the goal here is, or the stated purpose of Davutoğlu's agenda, which he wrote in the 90s. This is Davutoğlu in the 1990s. His discourse has evolved a great deal since then. It displays much more sort of pragmatic logic, sort of strategic logic these days. But there is underpinning his vision. There is an agenda of de-Eurocentering Turkish perspectives, which again does not have to necessarily mean an either-or scenario, but certainly there's a will to encourage Turks to think about the benefits of engaging regional actors, and the benefits of even engaging actors who may not be who may be anathema to Western interests. Obviously, this can take. This repertoire, this post-Islamist repertoire, it can, when push comes to shove, result in kind of very graphic metaphors that reflect the old Islamist logic in terms of, a monolithic and intrinsically violent Israel that is oppressing the Palestinians and so forth. I think in the recent Gaza incident, the discourse of the Humanitarian Relief Foundation, which was the Turkish pro-religious NGO that had organized the flotilla. I mean, that was kind of unreconstructed Islamist metaphors that were at play there, and while the party was very careful to distance itself from the flotilla itself, there was obvious sympathy on the part of certain leading figures within the party for this sort of post-Islamist logic and agenda. This type of discourse, it's really deployed to score points on the primarily Arab Muslim street, and it's also used in Israel baiting, which again is something that is not so much, not necessarily directed against Israel per se, but a way to increase Turkey's sort of prestige and power of projection in its neighborhood, and also appeals to the core constituents of the party who've been with it since the beginning. Before the unreconstructed constituents. The third discourse I've mentioned is Ottomanism, and this again, we can be. I don't say neo-Ottoman because that's explicitly what the party rejects. I think that there's a more sort of diffuse, rather than a political agenda, there's a more diffuse will to rehabilitate the memory of the Ottoman period. The prime audience in this respect is is certainly former Ottoman territories, but it's also domestic, and I would actually argue that it's above all domestic because it's a real source of pride, and it's quite empowering for a country that has undergone a series of quite devastating sort of social and economic and existential crises over the past 80 years. And so I would say it's actually primarily oriented towards domestic audiences, but it is certainly also projected with an emphasis on the Ottoman Islamic past towards the Muslim world and the Arab world in particular, and an emphasis on the Turkic dimension of Ottoman legacies in interactions with Azerbaijan, with Turkmenistan, and so forth. With the Central Asian countries. Now, it does fall into, we can think of it as one of the two prime pillars of Davutoğlu's foreign policy, which he set out systematically in a book that was published in 2005 called Strategic Depth. And the first pillar is this historical pillar. It's the idea that some countries in this world are blessed with, or cursed perhaps, considering the old Chinese curse to be born in interesting times. Some countries are blessed with with being at the historical epicenters, which means that they are at, they find themselves at the center of world historical events. And such countries include France and Britain and the United States, and also Turkey as the heir of the Ottomans. And that this historical depth gives these countries an ability to develop sort of organic cultural relations, or to develop all sorts of ties with the various countries that were within its sort of historical radar. And this is again a source of outreach to. This is a source of. This is rhetorically deployed a lot in outreach to the Arab world and the Turkic worlds. That said, Davutoğlu is also very pragmatic, and it's rarely invoked, of course, when Turkey is engaging with Armenians or with Serbians, for example. So it's sort of a selective projection of Ottoman memories to people who may be inclined to have favorable recollection of the legacies, and there's a great deal of restraint in terms of projecting this message to people who are more ambivalent towards the Ottoman past. Now, I do want to focus, the thrust of my presentation has been on the AKP leadership in its discourses, but I do think Ottomanism is important enough as a sociological phenomenon that it's worth looking at other more diffuse expressions of it, certainly at the national and municipal level, but also in broader society at large. Every day I come across a new manifestation of this sort of will to remember and rejoice in the Ottoman past. You see it in the new banknotes that are proudly emblazoned on the no longer hyperinflationary Turkish lira, where you have figures, turban figures, and also a woman, for example, but an anti-Kemalist woman emblazoned on one of the banknotes. You see it in the erection of new statues all over the place. It's, very much in keeping with Eric Hobsbawm's frame of invented tradition. There is a real will and push to inaugurate new holidays based on Ottoman reference points rather than Republican reference points. So the conquest of Istanbul in 1453 is well on its way to becoming a bank holiday. I think it's still not. I think it's still not an official holiday, but there's a large festival and a costume parade with people dressed up as janissaries going around to celebrate the conquest of Istanbul by the Ottoman Turks. There's the Tulip Festival, which the Istanbul municipality, for example, pays up to $2 million a year for about a 10-day festival in which tulips, which were of course an Ottoman symbol that was exported to Holland and then the tradition was lost in Turkey itself. The purpose of the festival is to bring the tulip home in the discourse of municipal officials, and they spend a lot of money in order to plant millions of tulips all over the city. It's really actually very beautiful, but gives rise to a lot of debates about whether that money could be better spent. You see this in debates in the intelligentsia about Ottoman legacies, not only among pro-religious actors, but also among many liberals, many people from all factions of society. There's an attempt to come to grips intellectually as well with what the Ottomans were and what the consequences of that are for Turkey today. And then you see it in social and very much in sort of pop cultural expressions of this Ottomanism. So there's been a slew of movies, for example, which have kind of Indiana Jones type heroes with their fez and their mustaches who are running around saving Turkey from the evil British imperialists and so forth. And in fact, I mean, even among my students, for example, at the university, even secular students are starting to wear mustaches. This has become quite the trend in the past year or two, which is something that is again quite anathema to the old sort of Kemalist Westernist emphasis on physically looking Western. There's been a peak in the or spike in the popularity of mustaches recently. But you also see the motifs in clothing, in architecture, in fashion. And again, this is not only people who are affiliated, and very often people who are critical of the party. There's just been a general renaissance in the memory of the Ottoman period. So this brings me to the fourth and last strand, which is, I've argued, is really the most powerful consideration for party. For the party leadership, and this for me is a source of hope of the possibility that the paths that are taken don't have to be mutually exclusionary. This is the soft power logic. It's really based on, in many respects, on lessons learned from the incomplete EU accession process. It's the second pillar of Davutoğlu's foreign policy. As I said, there's the historical pillar on one hand, and then there's this kind of there's this emphasis on Turkey's geopolitical position and the advantages that this can bring in terms of making the country a hub for regional trade and certainly energy and pipelines politics and this is this has been implemented, very conscientiously implemented, through via the principle of zero problems with neighbors, which is something that Davutoğlu was pushing back when he was a foreign policy advisor from behind the scenes, and certainly since he became foreign minister in 2009. This is the idea that that if Turkey is going to can't sit around and wait forever for the EU to accept it as a member. And it finds itself in certainly a problematic geography and has outstanding problems with almost all of its neighbors. So if Turkey is not going to waste its time waiting around for the EU to open the door, it's best served by fixing its relationships in the neighborhood in such a way as to bring added value to Turkey, the neighborhood, and presumably also to the EU if it should ever decide to unblock the accession process. Again, the instruments that are used here are bi- and multilateral diplomatic instruments, very intensive pursuit of trade relationships. Whenever or very often when the foreign minister travels abroad, he brings with him delegations of businessmen. There's certainly emphasis on educational exchanges and cultural exchanges. So, for example, big exhibits on Iranian civilization, for example, Persian civilization and the affinities between Persian civilization and Ottoman civilization and so forth. And here I would say the aspiration someone has said this about Putin's Russia. The aspiration is, if not by tanks, then by banks. This is, I think, really the driving logic behind the AKP's policies, and the audience in this respect is really everyone. There's an open for business attitude and mentality. And this is, of course, completely compatible with the party's commitments to the EU and Washington. Now, to conclude, as I said, I think it's useful to disaggregate the party's repertoire into these four discourses, because we can see that what appears to be sort of confusing and inconsistent is really these are really episodes where one discourse that has been emphasized for a long time in a certain context is, for one reason or another, displaced by a second or a third logic with which it actually clashes in some respects. And as I mentioned, this is what I think, in effect, this is a frame we can use to explain what went so awry in the aftermath of the Gaza flotilla. I think the soft power logic is very promising in the sense that it can help reconcile the problematic tensions associated with the other three strands. So, for example, if you're thinking in sort of win-win terms about the need to establish Turkey as a soft power vis-a-vis domestic constituents and the people who you engage with internationally, then you will have more of an incentive to take into account the concerns being articulated by the 40% of the population that voted no to the referendum. And as I said, I think the no vote was not I mean, I can't quantify it, but I expect that the people who were voting no to civilianization, for example, were far less than the people who were voting no to a concern that there would be no more institutionalized checks or balances on the party's hegemony. So, in a sense, if you're thinking in this positive sum logic, then you can find ways to build in guarantees that will assuage the concerns of people who aren't your natural constituents. Likewise, it can help you back down from getting into a spiral of negative dynamics in the Middle East. I mean, Turkey will never be able to, nor do I think it ever wants to, outshout Iran, obviously. And I think there's probably been some cognizance in the aftermath of the nuclear deal and Gaza that a play to the Muslim street is can get one in deep waters, since one can never one can never be more dramatic than Iran, but one can very much alienate Israel and the United States. So again, if this sort of pragmatic soft power logic holds, then it should serve as a sort of constraint or restraint on the post-Islamist logic. And again, as I said, in the neo-Ottomanist, or the Ottoman, again, problematic term, in the Ottomanist or historical discourses, you already see this soft power logic at play, and that these historical references are deployed very selectively towards audiences who are likely to be moved, and not towards audiences who are likely to be irritated. So again, to conclude, the danger in this situation, I think, is that because there are these four strands, and because they do contain internal contradictions and can overlap in peculiar ways, the danger is one of the AKP's interlocutors abroad reading the party's agenda and reducing everything to one of the particular strands, in particular to the conservative religious or post-Islamist strand, because there is this self-fulfilling prophecy type of dimension. If the party is sort of repeatedly receives the message that it is faced with a stark choice between the West and the rest, as I've said, it's no longer, it does not envisage Turkey as any longer being in a position where it has to subordinate its interests to the West, but it doesn't necessarily want this to be to amount to a parting of ways. I think it's very dangerous to hone in on the sort of the post-Islamist references and take the party to be only that, because it could lead to a dynamic in which that trend, in which that discourse is reinforced, and then in fact And then, in fact, the choice about which road to take does become a stark one indeed. So.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. You've given us a lot to chew on there. Now the floor will be opened for your questions. Will you please wait for the microphone to come around to you once you're recognized, and will you please identify yourself before speaking? Who would like to start us off? May we start with the lady here and then the gentleman here?
Thank you very much for the very comprehensive review of what happens in Turkey. My name is Julia Klonis. I'm an economist working on development in less developed countries. One of your original comments in your introduction somehow challenges me to play the devil's advocate. Mm-hmm. You mentioned, if I heard you correctly, that Turkey no longer is willing to subjugate or put the Turkish interest below that of the Western interests. There is the point of view that that is what Turkey has done all along. In the First, Second World War, somehow looked into what was the Turkish sometimes going against the Allies' interests, even in 2003 with Iraq. And that point of view says that what is different now is that that strategy becomes more open and more sort of visible. Would you comment on that, please? Thank you.
Should I answer right away, or take the questions? I think fair enough. I think I wouldn't take issue with your taking issue. In fact, because there are certain the AKP very much likes to project itself as heralding a new era, of course, in Turkish in Turkish domestic and international life, but there are certainly continuities in diplomatic strategies adopted not just across various periods in the Turkish Republic, but also with the late Ottoman approaches to engage in outstanding international questions. And so a very kind of subtle diplomacy that is today perhaps less subtle, but it's certainly multidimensional, in which Turkey, based on its very its prime real estate that gives it a lot of leverage vis-a-vis a lot of actors, has always definitely tried to play various Western actors against each other in order to ensure its own continuity. This is how the sick man of Europe outlived the Russian dynasty that gave it the name. Not for just by a few years, but the Ottoman Empire did outlive, of course, the czars. And so I would agree with you that there's certainly continuity in this respect, but I think the Cold War era may have been an exception. So maybe that's a way we can reconcile what you're saying and what I'm saying, is that yes, after the First and Second World Wars, this was the case, increasingly so today. In the Cold War and its immediate aftermath, there was very much a psychology of taking a priori what the West thought to be the appropriate course of action, regardless of what the costs were for Turkey. And so this is probably most salient in Ozal's decision after to shut off the pipelines with Iraq in the first Gulf War, which cost Turkey a great deal. So that would be my response.
May we have the microphone here, please?
Yeah, I have the mic.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. My name is Koray Ertaş. I'm from the Turkish Embassy. First of all, I would like to welcome our guest speaker. I wish all the debates about Turkey in this town will be that much in depth and bruised with academic information, let's say. But unfortunately, we hardly see, and we generally see political statements made on the Turkish foreign policy and the way that Turkey is heading towards. If I may make two comments and questions about both the domestic developments in Turkey and also the foreign policy of Turkey. As we all know, globalization has many different phases in different contexts. So unlike the neoliberal academics like Fukuyama, we don't see a deterministic path or teleological path for globalization. So there's a different path in China, and there's a different path in Poland, or there's a different path in Turkey. So given this overarching reality, I believe the Turkish model, having a very different structure than the structure that was present in the West, the point that the Turkish model reached represents a quite significant example or a success story. Imagine that the infrastructure, as we call, where we have no bourgeois in a state, or well-functioning economy, or there is no true separation of the church and the state. And then we see the role of the agent when one leader comes and try to bring the new order to a completely different set of structure. So, of course, as a government representative, it's easy for me to say this is a success, but I would like to take your view on the future direction of our democracy, which we are proud of. On the foreign policy side, I had a little bit question about the idea of de-Eurocentrization of Turkish foreign policy. I believe this is a bit injustice to current foreign minister, because even before, like 10 years ago, for example, I'm at the Foreign Service for like 15 years. In our talking points, when we start to explain Turkish foreign policy, we were saying one of the most important tenets of our foreign policy is multifaceted nature of it. And we always have been saying that the relationship with Russia is actually not excluding our relationship or strong ties with the West. We were saying it just before. And the change of the Cold War years was representing a strong change of an independent variable, which has direct impact on your foreign policy. And we have a very large, new, fertile environment that we can make foreign policy. These areas were actually not existing during the Cold War. The borders were so tight, and we have certain limits, so we cannot maneuver in many of the issues. We will just follow what our allies were doing. But now there's a huge area, and we cannot stand still, actually, because if we stand still, then we take the burden. This happened in Iraq. This happened just recently between after the war between Georgia and Russia, where the Turkish truck owners just lined up through the border. And this will happen in Iran, actually. And we have many difficulties in explaining our policy on Iran, for example, to our U.S. friends and counterparts, in saying that our strategic objective is the same. We never want a nuclear Iran, but we have different styles because we have suffered a lot because of the calamities in our immediate neighborhood. It's easy, for instance, I don't want to name a country, but let's say Portugal, to go along with sanctions to Iran because it's far away, but it will be so much problematic, and actually it will deal a heavy blow to our both economic situation and also our political situation. Therefore, I would like to caution a bit on this.
Okay, but then can you, if you'd like to ask a question.
Yeah, the question then about foreign policy is our relationship with Israel is a question here in this town because of the recent incidents. For the past 6 years, during this government's period, the relationship between Turkey and Israel was perfect. It was just in the good old days. And the relationship was started to rupture after the Cast Lead operation and then the flotilla incident. And here in this town, unlike the perception in Turkey, unfortunately, the perception is that Turkey has made a mistake in sending the ships to the shores of Gaza, whereas the perception in Turkey is totally different, where a civilian ship went there and then was brutally raided by military people. Based on your assessments and comments, how do you see our relationship with this important country, a friend of Turkey actually, will move forward? Do you think that there will be a fundamental shift on the Turkish side or on the Israel side, or are you foreseeing a further and further deepening of the crisis? Thank you.
Okay. So, rich and tough questions. I'll start with the first one. I think there's a frame in academia, in sociology in particular, that really captures the dynamic that you're talking about in terms of alternative trajectories of modernization, and particularly in an era of globalization, and that is the idea of alternative modernities. There's been put forth by various sociologists, which basically says that, yes, modernity first emerged in the West, and it involved certain institutions that also reflected parochial aspects of the Western experience. So, for example, separation of the public and private spheres, or certain understandings of certain frames for understanding democracy, and that as long as people are using precisely those standards to measure the degree to which they have achieved modernity, then people coming from non-Western backgrounds will always come up lacking. And this is sort of the perennial, the sort of Sisyphean project of trying to modernize and Westernize, but somehow it's seeming like a pale imitation of what these institutions and ideas look like in Western context. And yet there's so in this context, for example, Japan is often cited as an interesting case in which, for all effective purposes, Japan is hyper-modern, but yet the Japanese understanding of democracy, for example, doesn't include, certainly to the same extent as it does in the West, the notion of alterity and how there needs to be somehow some alterance in political parties. And so I think what you're talking about here is the critique of Kemalist modernism, in that it was an attempt to introduce modernity without the sociological conditions for it being present initially, and so that this led to a gap and a rupture and so forth. And this is something that has been articulated by some leading Turkish scholars, and I do think that if there is something that is very promising today about the Turkey's, in particular, its embrace of globalization in the past 10 years, and using these sort of global structures as the motor for the country's both internal and international development, it's something that can be read in the framework of alternative modernities. So the structures the political structures that emerge out of this, for example, may entail a rich and a vibrant democracy, but it might not take precisely the same forms as it takes in say Germany or France or so forth. But that said, I think the challenges, it's really the overwhelming challenge, and if Turkey can pull this off, then I think in both domestically and internationally, it will really reach that proverbial potential that observers about Turkey have been waxing about poetically for years, and that Turkey only seems to now slowly be actually rather quickly, seems to be rising to that challenge. The real test will be whether, in the context of an alternative Turkish Muslim modernity, there is meaningful pluralism and meaningful space for people within the society who are who may, for example, feel a strong affinity for the distinction between public and private when it comes to expressions of religiosity, for example, which is something that the alternative modernity framework permits one to blur. And so I think that's the real challenge. And I think if Turkey can pull off in a meaningful way, consolidate its domestic, put its house in order domestically, then the rest will actually follow. And concerns in Washington that Turkey, or in the EU, that Turkey may be going on, on alternative pathways will be assuaged, and Turkey will also finally then be able to fulfill its perennial promise as a model for other neighboring regions with which it has much more interaction, and certainly where its interests are much more salient in the post-Cold War context. Which brings me to your second question, and in here I hope I wasn't misunderstood. I didn't mean to say that there wasn't a European pillar to the foreign minister's policy, and I had the opportunity to see him speak in Oxford a few months ago, in May, actually, at a conference on Turkey's new foreign policy, and he quite deftly, it was interesting, he didn't mention Europe very much. In an hour-and-a-half lecture to Oxford dons and students, he hardly used the word Europe at all, and yet it was a very kind of it was a speech and an address that really, I think, captured the logic of what Europe is about, in the sense that he was talking about again, talking about soft power, talking about pluralism, talking about having multiple frames of reference, about questioning frames that lead to sort of binary readings of East and West. And if this, for me, is the sort of the great tragedy of the Turkey-EU relationship in the past 5 or 6 years, is that Turkey really presented the EU with an opportunity to consolidate this European peace project based on recognition of the other as constituent of the self. And it was the litmus test. And I think EU actors have really, for obviously a variety of complex reasons, and not, there are some people I would point the finger at, but it's not only the Sarkozys of the world who are responsible. But I think that what Davutoğlu does is actually a very sophisticated way of affirming what it could mean to be European, precisely by challenging traditional categories of what it is to be European, culturalist categories of what it is, and thinking more in terms of normative categories. So in that sense, I hope I wasn't misinterpreted. Certainly, there's been an opening up a lot of opportunity spaces that are that Turkey can not only take advantage of, but that it needs to take into consideration, because it obviously directly affects Turkey's own stability. In terms of the specifically relations with Iran on one hand and Israel on the other, I think everyone in this room is in a better position than I to really have a sense of where things are heading. That said, as an academic, I have the luxury of being able to be an optimist. Because I don't have to think through the nitty-gritty of how exactly this is going to be orchestrated and maneuvered. But I think that the Turkish government is ultimately, as I've said over and over again, they're ultimately pragmatists. I think if bridges have been burned with the current Israeli government, the prime minister, I expect in comments that were, I expect not as publicized as much in the Western press as they were in Turkey. He did specifically go out of his way to say that he had no issue with the Israeli people or the Israeli state, or certainly not with the existence of Israel, but that basically the party today has no interlocutors whatsoever with the current Israeli government. And so as an academic who can't know what's happening behind closed doors, I would like to think that sensible people in Washington, in Ankara, in Israel are finding ways to keep channels of communication open, because the challenge will be one of navigating what does seem to be there's arguments that there's a structural parting of ways between Turkey and Israel in terms of convergence of interest in structural terms. In the Middle East. And again, I think this is very much up for grabs. I think Turkey can pursue a middle way between trying to socialize Iran back into the international system on one hand, and maintaining cordial and cooperative relations with Israel. But with the current, I wouldn't be that optimistic in terms of interactions between the current government and the current Israeli government. I think their bridges have been burned.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Roger Kirk.
Do you want to wait for the microphone?
Roger Kirk, former diplomat. You have mentioned a couple of times the EU and Turkey's possible membership as something that is still conceivable. And I'm frankly quite doubtful about that. And I was wondering if that turns out to be something that isn't going to work, and that begins to become apparent to the Turkish people and the Turkish government, what effect will that have?
I think it's apparent. Yeah, no, I think it's apparent. I think there was, if one sort of wants to map out the evolution of perceptions of the EU and the EU project since I remember being in the office of an NGO in 1999 when Turkey was awarded candidacy, and there was sort of stark belief around the room. They couldn't believe it had actually happened, that the EU was actually kind of lifting, the gates and making membership a prospect. And so there was this, I think, cautious optimism up until 2002, and then with reforms and the whole momentum behind the reform process. I think that the Turkish government, both the coalition government that was in power between 1999 and 2002, and the AKP in its first term in power, I think they were sincere about the EU accession process, and then I think when the hat got let out of the, what's the expression, the rabbit, the hat, something got out of a bag, cat got out of the bag, rabbit out of the hat, I'm not sure. When this basically when the culturalist arguments became politically correct in the context of the debate over whether to open accession negotiations in 2004, and then the actual opening of negotiations in 2005. I think that was that sort of the moment that you're talking about. That's when the cognizance of resistance on the part of European actors really, I think, hit home. It had always been suspected as a subtext, but the European Commission, officially actors, had always so consistently denied that that culture mattered or that religion mattered. And I don't want to reduce European resistance to that, but it's certainly a very important factor. And so I think ever since 2005, there has been sort of tacit awareness in Turkey, certainly on the part of the populace. You certainly see this in terms of the figures, the levels of support for EU membership, which have declined drastically over the years. You see this in the phenomenon that I mentioned earlier, the kind of indigenization of European standards, either evoking them as universal or as the Ankara criteria, for example, the often counted discourse that is embraced by all people from all factions across the political spectrum, that we need to, most factions across the political spectrum, that we need to embrace these standards because it's for Turkey's good, not simply to get into the EU. They're intrinsically important. Then the day will come when we decide about the EU one way or another. So certainly in the second term in power, and in this sense, this maybe goes back to the previous point about the foreign minister not necessarily downplaying the EU, but very much playing up Turkey's relationships with other regions. I think that you would be pretty hard pressed to find anyone in the country at this point who, from a taxi driver to a policy analyst to an economist to a businessman, you would be hard pressed to find anyone who really thought who would place any money on the prospect of Turkey ever becoming a member of the EU. But you will find people who are very committed to the upholding and the realization of EU/universal standards in all sorts of walks of life, and people who believe that that anchor is extremely important. The mere prospect of membership, whether or not it materializes or not, that institutional anchor is very important for Turkey to complete what is actually the most pressing project in my mind, which is the consolidation of a meaningful pluralistic democracy.
Picking up on that last thing that you said, I'd like to ask if you would look at the two parts of the population, women and Kurds, and looking at your categories of democratization and then conservative religious post-Islamist, how would you see the country navigating in terms of policies towards those two groups? I know when I spoke with elite women in Turkey this summer, university professors, women's movement leaders, and so on and so forth, they seem to be terribly concerned about undoing some of the great gains that the women have managed to get in the civil code, the criminal code, and so on. And obviously there's recently been some violence on the part of Kurds, even though the PKK supposedly has disowned that. And I wonder to what extent that's going to set back that opening, that democratic opening. Can you talk about those things?
Yes. Let me just think a second about how to structure my response, because there's definitely, it's a very complex and important set of phenomena that you raised, and so let me think about how I would address it. Well, certainly two of the groups who are the most ambivalent about the party's sort of meteoric rise in recent years are non-religious women, in particular, and secular nationalist Kurds, as I mentioned, and also certainly Kurdish feminists who are the driving force actually behind the women's movement in Turkey today. And I've heard the BTP, the Kurdish party that is the nationalist party, as opposed to and speaks for sort of. He speaks for secularist nationalist Kurds rather than Kurds who identify more with an Islamic identity. I've heard it referred to as the only feminist party in Turkey these days, and so there's actually even overlap in these questions to a certain extent. And I think the main concern on the part of secular women is again not one of Sharia going to be implemented and gains that have been achieved in terms of state feminism over earlier on, and then the mobilization of liberal and third wave feminists in the 1980s and 1990s, and recently in the early 2000s to ensure that these that the criminal code and the civil code were rewritten in ways that reduced gender inequalities and gender discrimination. I think that concern is it's visceral, it's very real. Part of it may be based on a kind of Orientalist reading of the AKP agenda and a difficulty in having a conversation with veiled women, some of whom may have similar concerns or a similar agenda, but it's framed differently. This goes back to the alternative modernities things, and I've actually done some research on the extent to which women's organizations which are affiliated with rival camps in Turkish society are able to cooperate, and the extent to which their alternative or their other identities become primary and result in an inability to cooperate. So I've actually, together with a colleague, Hande Pakar at Bahçeşehir University, we've done interviews, quite extensive interviews with Kurdish women, liberal feminists, Kemalist feminists, and veiled women activists, some of whom embrace the term Islamic feminists, some of whom don't. Because again, this alternative modernist frame, they say that their agenda is not a feminist agenda, but it's one about achieving women's dignity and in frames of reference that make sense in Islam. And we found that when they're able to cooperate when it comes to issues like domestic violence, but when it comes to questions like the headscarf, the other affiliations always come slicing through. And in terms of how to assure those women who are not, who certainly don't look like the Prime Minister's wife or the First Lady, I think, on one hand, the onus is on the government to stand behind its professed commitment to ensuring that these women's lifestyles will not be subjected to any constraints. One of these types of inclusive gestures that I mentioned earlier that we saw recently was a conference that was organized in Istanbul last weekend. That a friend of mine was involved in the coordination of the project, and she said it was a madhouse. There were 2,000 women in a Congress center, and she looked around and counted. The only men in the room were the Prime Minister and his aides. And so there's a conscious attempt to reach out to these feminists and assure them that their concerns are being taken into account. That said, I guess there's two focal points, if I may. How much time do I have?
Another few minutes.
Another few minutes. Okay. I think there's sort of two focal points that around which this question revolves. One is the headscarf question, which has been and will continue to be, a real locus of tension in terms of the different aspirations and concerns of different groups in Turkish society. And the second one is this phenomenon called neighborhood pressure that has been raised by a prominent sociologist and then has been examined, investigated empirically by a political scientist. And here, okay, first the headscarf. The headscarf is really about different readings of what it means to be a modern woman in a Muslim context. And so the way that secular feminists read the headscarf is that it is disempowering, and it is a function of pressure on the part of patriarchal, forces within the family or within society, and so therefore it is something that should not be permitted in public contexts such as universities. The veiled women's argue precisely the opposite. They say that the headscarf is actually empowering in the sense that it permits women who do subscribe to conservative or traditional values to go out into big city streets, to ride buses, to work in workplaces, to work in offices under male bosses that otherwise they wouldn't be permitted to have these sorts of interactions with, and that it prevents them from being exploited or sexually harassed in the process. So whether, as I said, women are able to resolve that question will have a lot to do with this second phenomenon of neighborhood pressure. And this is basically the idea that, okay, in Turkey, even if you have all the formal rules of a democratic game and everyone being able to express themselves as they see fit, that there are diffuse social forces which make it difficult for women living in certain areas, to dress maybe as openly as they might feel like. Or I see this, for example, in the neighborhood that I live in, a residential area, quite, relatively prosperous, and there's grocers that sell alcohol near my house, and then a few blocks away, getting closer and closer to a shantytown, the grocers still sell alcohol, but they offer to paper bag it if you try and purchase it. And then a few blocks away on the edge of the shantytown, there's no alcohol sold at all. So that may be kind of you can kind of map the dynamics of this phenomenon of neighborhood pressure, which the Prime Minister insists does not exist. This empirical and extensive, quite comprehensive research conducted by a woman named Binaz Toprak, who you of course know. She spoke with 400 people across different towns in Anatolia, and she has expressed a great deal of concern and has become sort of the spokesperson of the worried modern woman, as it were, in terms of increasing neighborhood pressure in communities across Anatolia. The expectation on the part of many observers was that as these communities became more prosperous, which many of them have in recent years, thanks to their local entrepreneurs, embeddedness in global markets, and so forth. So you have these sort of thriving Anatolian towns. And she is concerned that in these towns, based on a lot of the feedback she's received, that there's a great deal of pressure to behave in ways that are congruent with conservative religious practices, and that this is also affecting women's prospects for employment and so forth. So this is, a report you can look it up online. I think it articulates that concern quite cogently. In terms of Kurds, and then again, that will be, I think, one of the most interesting things to observe in the post-referendum, pre-election Turkey. I anticipate that there's going to be a lot of discussion on the Kurdish question and whether it's going to be able to accommodate the demands of secularist nationalist Kurds within the new sort of constitutional order that the AKP is going to set forth. So I wouldn't want to speak just yet, but perhaps we can have a conversation again in 9 months' time, and then again after the elections, which I anticipate the AKP will win, again to see how they proceed on the Kurdish question.
Thank you. Any other questions? Well, in that case, I think you can all join me in thanking Professor Fischer for a wonderful presentation.